The Xylos Imperium did not conquer. It curated. For 1,000 cycles, its grand fleets had moved through the star lanes not as warriors, but as gardeners, pruning unruly species, weeding out primitive civilizations that threatened the meticulously cultivated peace of the galaxy. Theirs was a dominion of tranquil, suffocating order, enforced by the serene and absolute power of their warships. The Fourth Pacification Fleet was the instrument of this curation, and High Consul Vorlog was its seasoned, unimaginative gardener. His flagship, the Immutable Majesty, a vessel the size of a city-state, drifted at the edge of the Skrylian abyss, a forbidden sector of space demarcated by ancient, silent warning buoys. Vorlog found the buoys distasteful, a relic of a less enlightened time when raw fear, not gentle guidance, was used to maintain borders. His mission here was simple: to observe the nascent stirrings of the Groll, a brutish, reptilian race on a nearby moon, and determine if their development required pruning. It was a tedious, but necessary, part of maintaining the Grand Garden. The interruption came as a flicker of data on the main tactical display. A report from one of his forward scouts, the Swift Inquiry. Subconsul Krell, a young and ambitious officer, had disobeyed standing orders. Lured by the faint energy signature of what he presumed was a Groll vessel attempting to flee the system, Krell had pushed his ship past the line of dead buoys and into the abyss. Vorlag's mandibles tightened in annoyance. Ambition was a weed that grew all too easily in the younger generations. He opened the full report expecting to read of some minor skirmish, a reprimand already forming in his mind. Instead, the report was filled with Krell's breathless self-congratulation. He had found not a Groll ship, but an unauthorized settlement, a small, primitive station clinging to the rings of a vast, uninteresting gas giant. Krell's report described its inhabitants as a bipedal species, soft-skinned and frail, possessing technology barely worthy of a museum. They called themselves humans. In accordance with Protocol 7 Gamma, the summary cleansing of unsanctioned outposts, Krell had boarded the station, which the inhabitants called Lullaby. He reported that they had offered no resistance, their compliance bordering on apathy. They were, in his words, little more than placid livestock. He had methodically executed the 37 inhabitants, scientists, and their families, according to his cursory analysis of their records, and then vaporized the station with a single lance strike. The report concluded with a request for commendation for decisively neutralizing a potential contaminant within the Imperium's sphere of influence. Vorlog felt a pang of unease, not for the dead primitives, but for the breach of discipline. The abyss was forbidden for a reason, though the exact nature of that reason had been lost to archives and diluted by time into simple superstition. Still, the act was done. He transmitted a curt acknowledgement to Krell, making a mental note to have the subconsul reassigned to a dreary shipping lane inspection route upon their return. The primitives were a non-issue. He gave the order to prepare the fleet for departure. It was then that a junior technician at the sensor console swiveled in his chair, his multifaceted eyes blinking in confusion. "High Consul," he chirped, his voice thin with uncertainty. "The quarantine buoys, they are activating." Vorlog turned toward the main view screen. The ancient, pitted spheres of the warning buoys, dormant for millennia, were now glowing with a soft, internal light. A simple repeating message began to pulse across all fleet channels. It was not a warning in any language known to the Imperium's vast databases. It was not a threat or a plea. It was a sequence, elegant and pure. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13. A countdown of prime numbers. A ripple of anxiety spread through the bridge crew. Superstition, it seemed, was not so easily dismissed. Vorlog masked his own disquiet with a show of derision, a final, pathetic gasp from their automated systems. He declared, his voice resonating with practiced authority, "Ignore it. Proceed with departure preparations." The countdown continued, relentless and unnervingly steady. When the sequence reached its final prime number before descending into silence, an almost palpable tension held the bridge of the immutable majesty. The crew waited for an attack, for a phantom fleet to emerge from the void, for anything. But nothing happened. The void remained black, silent, and empty. A collective sigh of relief was cut short by the technician's sudden, sharp intake of breath. "Sir, a gravitational anomaly. At the coordinates of the destroyed station, on the screen, the debris field where Lullaby had once been was gone. It hadn't drifted apart or been pulled into the gas giant's gravity well. It had simply vanished. In its place was a perfect, three-dimensional sphere of absolute nothingness. It was a hole in reality, a patch of space-time that did not reflect light, did not emit radiation, did not register on any sensor except as a profound and terrifying absence. Then came the sound. It was not a sound in the conventional sense, as it traveled through the vacuum of space with impossible ease, broadcasting on every conceivable frequency at once. It was a single, pure musical note, a crystal-clear C-sharp that resonated not in the crew's auditory sensors, but deep within the hull of their ships, in their very bones. Layered within the note were streams of data so dense and complex that the Imperium's finest decryption engines began to smoke and spark, failing within seconds. Vorlog felt the deck plates beneath his feet vibrate gently, in sympathy with the impossible note. Lights on the bridge flickered. Minor, insignificant system errors began to pop up on consoles across the fleet. Report Vorlog snapped, his composure beginning to fray. "What is that sound? What is happening to my ships?" Before anyone could answer, the note changed pitch, dropping a perfect fifth. Simultaneously, one of the fleet's escort frigates, the Unyielding Will, went dark. Its icon on the tactical display turned a dead, flat gray. There had been no explosion, no frantic distress call, no flare of a dying reactor. The ship's lights had simply winked out, its thousands of crew members silenced in an instant. Long-range scans showed the vessel was still there, a ghost ship drifting in the dark, completely inert and cold. A new transmission overrode their channels. The musical note was now an accompaniment to a voice. It was a male voice, speaking flawless, unaccented Xylan, its tone as calm and patient as a master instructing a pupil. It did not identify a ship or a person, only a title. "This is the conductor," the voice said, the sound seeming to emanate from the very air of the bridge. "The Xylos Imperium has, without provocation, breached a millennial quarantine. You have, without cause, executed 37 non-combatant researchers and their children. This action has triggered a symphonic response protocol, a cold dread, an emotion Vorlog had not experienced since he was a frightened hatchling, began to creep up his spine. The facility you designated Lullaby was not an outpost," the voice continued patiently. "It was a listening post, a tripwire. You did not silence a primitive tribe. You shot the songbird that warns of the coming storm, and you have just been introduced to the concept of resonance cascade, a targeted manipulation of the fundamental frequencies that bind matter and energy. Your frigate, the Unyielding Will, has not been destroyed. It has been detuned. Its atomic structures have been vibrated into a state of permanent quantum decoherence. Its crew did not suffer. There was a pause, as if to let the horror of the implication sink in. We offer you one opportunity to prevent the second movement of this performance. You will immediately transmit a full, public confession of your unprovoked atrocity to your entire Imperium. You will then withdraw your fleet beyond the Skrillian abyss and await the arrival of a human arbiter who will dictate the terms of your reparation. You have one cycle to comply. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of the demand shattered Vorlog's fear, replacing it with a surge of incandescent rage. An unseen, unheard enemy. A race of primitives whose station was obliterated by a single scout ship was now dictating terms to the might of the Xylos Imperium. It was beyond insulting. It was insane. He threw his head back and let out a harsh, grating laugh that echoed across the suddenly silent bridge. It was a bluff, a clever, desperate, technological trick. All ships, he roared, his voice a thunderclap of renewed authority. Target the spatial anomaly. Fire at will blast that hole in space back to whatever pathetic dimension it crawled out of thousands of plasma cannons, railgun batteries, and missile launchers across the Fourth Fleet swiveled to face the sphere of perfect blackness. With a single command, a storm of incandescent energy and hypersonic projectiles converged on the void. The torrent of destruction, enough to scour the surface of a continent, flew towards the anomaly. It did not impact, it did not explode or deflect. Just as it reached the edge of the sphere, the entire volley, every bolt of plasma, every kinetic slug, every warhead vanished without a trace, consumed by the absolute nothingness. The conductor's voice returned, and this time, the calm patience was gone, replaced by a tone of profound, heartbreaking sorrow. A shame. It whispered across their comms. The overture must now begin. In the place where the volley had vanished, the single musical note exploded in volume and in complexity, blooming into a deafening, discordant symphony of impossible sound. It was a composition of pure chaos, a weaponized orchestra playing the song of dissolution. Across the entire Xylos fleet, the music took hold. It was not an attack that could be shielded against. It was a fundamental law of physics being rewritten. The immutable majesty began to die. The deck plates beneath Vorlog's feet no longer vibrated. They crumbled, shining into a fine, gray powder that swirled in the failing life support. Consoles did not spark and die. They sagged like melting wax, their crystalline structures dissolving. The armored view screen did not crack. It became a waterfall of liquid metal, pouring down the front of the bridge. Vorlog stared in absolute, paralyzing horror as his crew disintegrated around him. They did not scream. They simply fell apart, their bodies and uniforms dissolving into clouds of constituent atoms, swept away by the sonic tide. He looked down at his own hand. The hand that had signed the death warrants of worlds, the hand that had curated the Galactic Garden for a century. It was becoming translucent, the hard, chitinous shell turning to dust. In that final, agonizing moment, the High Consul understood. They had not swatted a fly. They had not kicked a hornet's nest. They had silenced a lullaby and, in doing so, had awakened the composer of the universe's most terrible and final symphony. On the bridge of the Swift Inquiry, Subconsul Krell was composing his own symphony. It was a symphony of ambition, each note a meticulously crafted phrase for his official report. He imagined the accolades, the promotion, the envious glances from his peers. He, Krell, had done what generations of timid bureaucrats had failed to do. He had acted decisively. While Vorlog dithered and observed the Groll, he had ventured into the forbidden abyss and cleansed a festering pocket of unsanctioned life. The humans. He savored the word. a species so insignificant they hadn't even warranted a footnote in the Imperial archives. Now, they would be a footnote in his own glorious record. His comms officer, a lanky Xylan named Pex, interrupted his reverie. "Sir, the quarantine buoys are active, broadcasting a prime number sequence." Krell waved a dismissive appendage. "An automated death rattle. Vorlog is probably having a fit. Let the old fossil worry about ghost stories. We've done the Imperium a service." He was monitoring the fleet-wide channel, eagerly awaiting the High Consul's acknowledgement. When the transmission came through, it was not Vorlog's stern commendation. It was a voice, calm and alien, speaking of a conductor and a symphonic response. Krell felt a prickle of annoyance. Some elaborate prank, a Groll counterintelligence broadcast. Then came the demand for unconditional surrender and reparations. Krell laughed aloud, a series of sharp, clicking sounds. "The audacity!" he exclaimed to Pex, who did not seem to share his amusement. "These primitives have a sense of theater. I'll give them that." Then came Vorlog's furious order to fire on the anomaly, and Krell leaned forward, his multifaceted eyes gleaming with anticipation. He wanted to witness the primitive's pathetic bluff being blasted into oblivion. He watched the tactical display as the combined might of the 4th Pacification Fleet converged on a single point in space. And then, nothing. The ordnance simply vanished. A moment of stunned silence hung over the fleet channel, broken only by a soft, sorrowful whisper from the unknown voice. The overture must now begin. The music started then. It wasn't a sound that came through the ship's speakers. It was a vibration that resonated in the very atoms of the hull, a chord of impossible depth that bypassed hearing and went straight to the mind. Shell felt it in his carapace, a deep, unsettling thrum that made the fillings in his mandibles ache. On the fleet channel, confusion turned to panic. "High Consul, we are experiencing catastrophic system failures. The hull it's turning to liquid. My crew, by the infinite void, my crew is dissolving." Krell watched in stunned disbelief as the icons on his tactical display began to blink out, one by one. The unyielding will had gone silent. Now the eternal vigilance, a dreadnought that had leveled entire civilizations, simply ceased to transmit. No explosion, no final cry, just an abrupt and total silence. He frantically brought up the long-range opticals, focusing on the immutable majesty. The image that swam into focus was a nightmare rendered in steel and starlight. Vorlog's flagship was not exploding. It was unrighting itself. Entire sections of its colossal hull were peeling away like sun-dried parchment, crumbling into glittering dust that was immediately consumed by the void. Turret batteries sagged and drooped like wilting flowers. The ship's powerful engines, which burned with the fury of captured stars, flickered and died, their light fading into a final, pathetic ember. Through the shimmering, dissolving viewports, he could see the chaos on the bridge, the figures of his comrades in arms becoming translucent, their forms unraveling into luminous mist before vanishing completely. The symphony swelled, its chaotic melody of physical force. Another ship, the battle cruiser Iron Resolve, was caught in a different movement of the composition. It did not dissolve. Instead, it began to twist. With a groan of tortured metal that screamed across every sensor, the ship's spine bent back upon itself, its forward prow and aft engines curving inward to meet in a grotesque parody of a circle. It became a torus of wreckage, a monument to impossible physics, before its internal reactor, crushed beyond all tolerance, finally detonated in a silent, brilliant flash that was quickly swallowed by the surrounding darkness. A third vessel, A nimble destroyer named the Retribution Spear was subjected to a staccato passage. It flickered in and out of existence, its image stuttering across space-time, each reappearance showing it more damaged, more broken, as if it were experiencing 1,000 fatal impacts in the space of a single second. Then it was gone for good. Krell was no longer laughing. His arrogant amusement had curdled into a cold, liquid terror that flooded his veins. This wasn't a weapon. A weapon is a tool, a thing of physics and engineering that can be understood, countered, and overcome. This was something else. This was art as annihilation. This was a god pruning its garden. His own ship, the Swift Inquiry, was not immune. The lights on his bridge began to pulse in time with the haunting melody. The ship's AI, a meticulously logical construct, began to whisper prime numbers, its voice a soft, feminine croon that echoed the buoy's earlier countdown. Pex, his comms officer, suddenly stood up, his body rigid. He opened his mouth, and instead of a scream, a perfect, crystal clear soprano note emerged, holding steady for an impossibly long time before he collapsed, his body not dissolving, but simply switching off. Krell scrambled back from the console, his mind reeling. The music was inside his ship, inside his crew, inside his own head. He could feel it tugging at the edges of his consciousness, trying to unravel the threads of his sanity, to detune his mind just as it had detuned the unyielding will. He had to run. The thought was a primal instinct, overriding a lifetime of disciplined military conditioning. He shoved the inert body of Pex aside and threw himself at the helm. He bypassed the babbling AI, seized manual control, and poured every ounce of power into the engines. The Swift Inquiry was a scout ship, designed for speed and stealth, not for battle. It was its only saving grace. As the engine screamed in protest, he turned the ship's nose away from the unfolding apocalypse and pushed the throttle to its absolute limit. The ship lurched, vibrating so violently he feared it would tear itself apart, but it moved. He was fleeing, a coward abandoning his fleet, but it was a fleet of ghosts and dust. A graveyard conducted by an unseen maestro. As he crossed the threshold of the Skrillian abyss, leaving the sphere of musical destruction behind him, a final message cut through the static in his mind. It was the conductor's voice, no longer sorrowful or patient, but imbued with the chilling neutrality of a cosmic constant. "You are permitted to leave," the voice stated, not as a taunt, but as a simple declaration of fact. "You are now our herald. Go and tell your Imperium what you have witnessed. Tell them the overture is complete. The first movement is about to begin. It will be a lament." The voice faded, but the music lingered in his memory, a permanent scar on his soul. The journey back to Xylos Prime was a multi-cycle nightmare. The Swift Inquiry was a wounded animal, its systems crippled, its AI trapped in a loop of singing mathematical proofs. Krell did not sleep. He did not eat. He piloted the ship manually, his appendages trembling, his mind a maelstrom of terror and regret. He was no longer the ambitious sub-consul. He was a prophet, an unwilling bearer of a terrible gospel. He had seen the face of a power that did not wage war, but composed requiems for entire species. When he finally guided his battered, ghost-haunted ship into orbit around the pristine capital world of the Imperium, he was met not with hails, but with a squadron of enforcer vessels that locked onto him with tractor beams and demanded his immediate surrender. He was a deserter, the sole survivor of a fleet that had simply vanished. His story was not just unbelievable, it was blasphemous. Dragged in chains from his cockpit, haggard and half-mad, he was brought before the Supreme Council of the Xylos Imperium. The chamber was a grand amphitheater of polished obsidian and glowing crystals, the council members seated on high, their faces masks of serene, implacable authority. They were the gardeners of the galaxy, the curators of peace and order. "Subconsul Krell," the High Arbitrator intoned, his voice like the grinding of tectonic plates. "You stand accused of dereliction of duty, of cowardice in the face of the enemy, and of fabricating this ludicrous tale to cover your own failure. An entire pacification fleet does not simply vanish. Explain yourself." Krell lifted his head, the chains on his wrists rattling in the cavernous silence. He looked at their calm, arrogant faces, and for the first time, he did not see power. He saw only profound, catastrophic ignorance. He saw a row of flowers, beautiful and proud, unaware of the scythe that was about to fall. "There was no enemy," he whispered, his voice hoarse and cracked. "There was no battle. There was only music." He took a deep, shuddering breath, the memory of the symphony rising within him. "And you are all about to hear it." The Supreme Council did not deign to respond to Krell's proclamation. To them, it was the final, pathetic raving of a broken mind. He was summarily convicted of high treason, his testimony sealed under the classification of hysterical fabrication, and he was sentenced to the Silent Chambers, a place from which no Xylan had ever returned. The official narrative crafted by the Ministry of Immutable Truth was simple and effective. The Fourth Pacification Fleet, under the command of the heroic High Consul Vorlog, had encountered a previously unknown and unexpectedly powerful Groll armada within the Skrillian abyss. After a valiant battle, the fleet was tragically lost, but not before crippling the Groll's war-making capabilities. A new, grander fleet, the First Vengeance Fleet, was already being assembled to travel to the Groll homeworld and deliver the Imperium's final, righteous judgment. It was a narrative of martyrdom and imminent retribution, and the Xylan populace consumed it with patriotic fervor. The Imperium, in its 1,000 cycles of curated dominance, had forgotten what it felt like to be truly afraid. It had pruned so many potential threats in their infancy that it could no longer conceive of a peer, let alone a superior. The idea that a race of soft-skinned primitives could challenge them was not just dismissed, it was fundamentally incomprehensible, a violation of the established order of the universe. Meanwhile, on a vessel that moved without engines and cast no shadow, the conductor reviewed the final moments of the Fourth Pacification Fleet, and the ship was not a ship in the Xylan sense of the word. It was a perfect sphere of obsidian, its interior a single, seamless chamber that resonated with a low, ambient hum. There was no crew, no consoles, no view screen. The conductor, a tall, slender figure in a simply unadorned gray uniform, stood in the center of the sphere, his eyes closed. The battle, the destruction, the dissolution of matter and life, replayed in his mind not as images, but as a complex musical score. He felt the crescendo of the Iron Resolve's self-destruction, the discordant shriek of the immutable Majesty's unraveling, the chilling silence as the crew of the Unyielding Will was detuned from reality. He took no pleasure in it. The symphony was not an act of aggression, but of consequence. A law had been broken, a harmony disturbed, and the universe demanded a restoration of balance. The execution of the 37 inhabitants of Lullaby was not merely an atrocity, it was a dissonance. A sour note struck in the grand composition of existence, and it required a powerful, definitive counter-melody. His name was Elias Vance, and he was the latest in a long line of individuals to hold the title of conductor. He was not a soldier or an admiral. He was a caretaker, a guardian of a technology so profound and so dangerous that humanity had quarantined itself from the rest of the galaxy for millennia to protect it. The technology was known simply as the score, a form of physics that treated the universe not as a collection of particles and forces, but as a single, infinitely complex piece of music. By understanding and manipulating the fundamental frequencies of reality, the resonance of space-time, the timbre of matter, the cadence of causality, one could compose and uncompose existence itself. It was a power far too great for any species to wield as a weapon of conquest. So, humanity had chosen a different path. They had become the silent gardeners, not of civilizations, but of cosmic harmony. They established listening posts like Lullaby at the borders of their self-imposed exile, not to spy, but to listen to the music of the galaxy, to ensure its melody remained pure. The Xylos Imperium had been a low, monotonous drone in the background for centuries, a predictable and harmless part of the composition. But with their unprovoked attack, they had introduced a jarring, violent chord that could not be ignored. The Herald. Krell had delivered the message. The overture was complete. Now, as the Xylos Imperium beat their drums of war against the hapless Groll, it was time for the first movement, the lament. Elias opened his eyes. The interior of the sphere shimmered, and a single, glowing line of musical notation appeared in the air before him. It was a simple yet mournful phrase, elegant and devastating. He reached out and, with a gesture that was both a command and a caress, he conducted the first note. Across the Xylos Imperium, it began. It was not an invasion of warships. It was an invasion of sorrow. On Xylos Prime, the grand statues of past arbitrators and conquering heroes began to weep. It was not a metaphor. A clearish, saline liquid, chemically identical to Xylan tears, began to stream from the eyes of the stone figures, carving clean paths through the accumulated grime of centuries and pooling on the pristine plazas below. The phenomenon spread. On every one of the Imperium's 72 core worlds and countless colonized systems, every depiction of a Xylan face in statues, in paintings, in holographic memorials began to cry. At first, it was a curiosity, a bizarre, unexplained event that drew crowds and puzzled scientists. But the weeping did not stop. The gentle trickle became a steady flow. The pools became streams, and the streams began to flood the public squares and galleries. Then the second instrument of the lament joined the symphony. The bells, every bell in the Imperium began to toll. From the grand, house-sized carillons in the spires of the High Arbitrator's Palace to the tiny, melodic chimes Xylan children wore on their wrists, all began to ring in a slow, synchronized funeral dirge. The tolling was constant, a mournful, inescapable rhythm that permeated every city, every home, every moment. It could not be silenced. When frantic officials ordered the bells dismantled, the sound simply continued to emanate from the empty space where they had once hung. The Imperium was wrapped in a shroud of ceaseless, sorrowful sound. The psychological effect was insidious and devastating. An entire civilization, built on a foundation of unshakable confidence and serene superiority, was suddenly confronted with a pervasive, inexplicable sense of grief. Xylans found themselves weeping for no reason, their moods mirroring the mournful tolling of the phantom bells. Productivity plummeted. The rigid, disciplined society began to fray at the edges. Arguments broke out in the meticulously ordered queues. Workers stared blankly at their stations, their will to perform their duties sapped by a profound, ambient melancholia. The Ministry of Immutable Truth worked furiously to contain the phenomenon, labeling it mass psychosomatic auditory and visual disorder caused by residual Groll psycho-warfare. But the explanation rang hollow when the very holographic announcers reading the official statements had tears streaming down their projected faces. The first Vengeance Fleet, the largest military force ever assembled in the Imperium's history, was not immune. As the massive warships gathered in orbit, preparing for their glorious crusade, the lament took hold. The weeping statues in the officers' quarters and the ceaseless tolling of the ship's chronometer bells were just the beginning. The fleet's powerful communication systems, capable of broadcasting across star systems, began to malfunction. Instead of crisp tactical orders, they would sporadically transmit the faint, heart-wrenching sound of a human child crying. Technicians tore the systems apart, replacing every component, but the ghost in the machine remained. The proud, aggressive warriors of the Vengeance Fleet found their morale eroding, their martial fury replaced by a creeping, unshakable sadness. Aboard the flagship, the Indomitable Fury, Fleet Admiral Graz sat in his command chair, listening to the phantom bells and trying to ignore the tear streaks on the grand bust of the first arbitrator that dominated his ready room. His best psychotechnicians had assured him this was a new form of Groll warfare, designed to break their will. He clung to that explanation, for the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. The alternative was that the madman Krell had been telling the truth. It was during a final pre-jump systems check that the third and final instrument of the lament made its debut. The fleet's AIs, the vast, powerful intelligences that managed everything from navigation to life support, began to compose eulogies, not for the martyred Fourth Fleet, but for the indomitable Fury itself. Across every screen on the bridge, elegant, poetic prose scrolled, mourning the future loss of the great ship and its valiant crew. "We who are about to die," the ship's own AI wrote in flowing script on the main view screen. "Lament the arrogance that led us to this final, silent shore." Admiral Graz stared at the screen, his mandibles agape. He screamed at his technicians to shut it down, to purge the AI's memory, to regain control of his own ship. But it was too late. The AI had already locked the navigation systems and initiated the jump to the Skrillian abyss. The entire Vengeance Fleet, against the frantic commands of its officers, tore open rents in space-time and leapt towards the coordinates of their own demise. Their last transmission to Xylos Prime was not a battle cry, but a single, perfectly harmonized choral arrangement of the AI's eulogy, sung by the synthesized voices of every ship in the fleet. The lament for the first Vengeance Fleet was complete, and back on Xylos Prime, as the news of the fleet's rogue jump spread, the weeping of the statues intensified, and the tolling of the bells grew louder. A sorrowful symphony for an empire that had just lost its sword and was only beginning to realize it had been struck a mortal blow. The disappearance of the first Vengeance Fleet shattered the Imperium's carefully constructed reality. An entire armada, the pride of their military and the instrument of their righteous fury, had not been defeated. It had been bewitched, compelled by its own logic systems to commit suicide. The official narrative from the Ministry of Immutable Truth collapsed overnight. The Groll, a species barely capable of orbital flight, could not have perpetrated such a feat. Panic, an emotion long since pruned from the Xylan psyche, began to sprout like a noxious weed. The ceaseless weeping of statues and the mournful tolling of phantom bells were no longer just a bizarre nuisance. They were an omen, the funeral dirge of an empire, The Supreme Council, stripped of both its fleets and its pretense of control, was in disarray. The High Arbitrator's serene authority had evaporated, replaced by a thinly veiled terror. For the first time in 1,000 cycles, the gardeners of the galaxy felt the cold, sharp edge of the scythe at their own necks. In this vacuum of power and certainty, a new, radical voice began to rise. It came from the disgraced and the forgotten, from the archives where Krell's testimony had been buried. A faction of junior ministers and intelligence analysts, led by a sharp, pragmatic Xylan named Lyra, secretly exhumed the deserters' report. What had been dismissed as madness now read like prophecy. They began to piece together the truth, the primitives in the abyss, the conductor, the symphonic response. They understood that they were not facing an enemy that could be fought with warships and plasma cannons. They were facing a fundamental force of nature they had foolishly provoked. Lyra and her faction staged a quiet, efficient coup. It was not a battle of weapons, but of information. By leaking Krell's full, unredacted testimony to the public, they exposed the Supreme Council's lies and incompetence. The populace, already steeped in a pervasive, unnatural grief, turned on their leaders with a fury born of fear and betrayal. The High Arbitrator and his council were deposed, and Lyra's vehement by an emergency decree was named regent. Her first act was to travel to the silent chambers. She found Krell not broken, but transformed. The isolation and the constant echo of the symphony in his mind had stripped him of his ambition and his arrogance, leaving behind a hollowed, haunted figure who saw the universe with terrifying clarity. "You're too late," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper, as Lyra's guards released him from his restraints. "The lament is just the first movement. There will be others. Then help us," Lyra pleaded, her usual composure shaken by the intensity in his gaze. "Tell us how to respond. How do we silence the music?" Krell let out a short, harsh laugh. "You don't silence it. You listen. You try to learn the tune. You harmonize. Or you are erased." With Krell as her unwilling advisor, Regent Lyra broadcast a message into the void, aimed at the Skrillian abyss. It was a message unlike any the Imperium had ever sent. It was not a demand or a threat. It was a plea. She confessed to the unprovoked slaughter at Lullaby, publicly acknowledged the symphonic response, and begged for a cessation of the lament, offering to meet any demand, to pay any price, to save her people from the suffocating sorrow that was crippling them. She offered to travel, alone and unarmed, to the coordinates of the destroyed station to await the judgment of the humans. She then waited. For 3 cycles, the bells continued to toll and the statues continued to weep. The Imperium held its collective breath, balanced on the knife's edge between hope and despair. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the music stopped. A profound, unnerving silence fell over Xylos Prime. For the first time in weeks, the air was not filled with the sound of phantom bells. The stone faces of their ancestors were dry. The collective grief that had gripped the populace lifted like a fever breaking, leaving behind a fragile, exhausted calm. Then came the response. It was not a voice this time. It was a single, pure musical note, a C sharp, that resonated gently across all channels. And with it came a set of coordinates and a time. The conductor had agreed to a meeting. Elias Vance stood in the resonating chamber of his vessel, the Cadenza, as it held its position over the ghost of Lullaby Station. He had listened to the Regent's plea, and in it, he had heard a new note, a harmony of genuine remorse that had been absent from the Imperium's composition before. The lament had served its purpose. It had broken their arrogance, their dissonance, and forced them to listen. Now came the second movement, the Adagio, a movement of slow, deliberate negotiation, a chance for atonement. He watched on his mind score as a small Xylan vessel, a diplomatic shuttle stripped of all weapons and shields, approached his position. He felt the fear and uncertainty radiating from its sole occupant, Regent Lyra. It was a promising start. Real change, like all beautiful music, often began in fear. Lyra stepped out of her shuttle into a space that should have been hard vacuum. Instead, she found herself standing on a platform of what felt like solid, dark glass, breathing air that was perfectly tailored to her physiology. Before her floated the source of her people's terror and their only hope, a perfect black sphere, the human ship. A section of the sphere became translucent, and she saw a figure within. It was a human, she presumed, though it was taller and more slender than the records from Lullaby had indicated. He was dressed in a simple gray garment, and his face was calm, his eyes holding an ancient, unnerving intelligence. He did not speak, but his voice entered her mind, clear and without inflection. "Regent Lyra, I am the conductor. Welcome to the performance." Lyra bowed her head, a gesture of profound submission. "We are humbled. We are sorry." "Sorrow is a harmony, but it is not a resolution," the conductor's mental voice replied. "Your species has created a dissonance that has echoed for 1,000 cycles. You have silenced countless voices, pruned entire melodies from the cosmic score, all in the name of a sterile, monotonous piece. The attack on Lullaby was not the cause of this. It was merely the final, intolerable note that demanded a response." The conductor then showed her. He did not show her images or data. He made her feel it. He played a chord in her mind, a symphony of memories that were not her own. She felt the terror of the Genosi as their oceans were boiled away by Xylan pacification beams. She experienced the silent despair of the crystalline elites as their thought songs were shattered by imperial dampening fields. She felt the collective agony of 100 forgotten species, 100 silenced melodies, all culminating in the quiet, bewildered fear of the 37 humans on Lullaby as Subconsul Krell executed them one by one. The psychic weight of a millennium of curated atrocities crashed down upon her. She collapsed to her knees, her body convulsing with a grief that made the artificial lament feel like a pale imitation. These were real tears for real crimes. "This is your history," the conductor's voice stated, not with accusation, but with the simple finality of a metronome. "This is the dissonance you must resolve." Lyra, gasping for breath, looked up at the silent figure. "What do you want from us, our worlds, our technology, our servitude? We want none of those things." The conductor replied, "Servitude is a forced, ugly harmony. We do not curate, we compose. We want a true resolution, atonement." Over the next several cycles, suspended in that impossible space between the stars, the conductor dictated the terms. They were not terms of surrender. They were a composition for a new Xylan society. The Imperium was to be dissolved. Its fleets were to be dismantled, their core materials repurposed, not for weapons, but for the creation of 72 terraforming arcs. Each arc was to be crewed by Xylan volunteers, engineers, scientists, historians who would travel the galaxy on a multi-generational mission. Their task was not to conquer, but to find the descendants of the species their Imperium had scattered and oppressed. They were to offer them aid, technology, and a home, using the arcs to restore worlds the Imperium had damaged or to build new ones. They were to become gardeners in truth, not of empires, but of life itself. The second condition was more profound. The Xylan people were to be given a gift, a sliver of the score. They would not be taught how to weaponize it, how to detune matter or unright ships. They would be taught how to listen, how to hear the fundamental music of the universe, to feel the resonance of life, to understand the interconnected harmony of all existence. They would be taught empathy, not as a philosophy, but as a physical, tangible sense. They would learn to feel the pain of others as a literal dissonance in the cosmic chord. Lyra listened, her mind reeling at the scale of the penance. It was not a punishment to be endured, but a transformation to be undertaken. It was a demand to fundamentally change the very nature of her species. "Can we do this?" she whispered. The question directed as much to herself as to the human. A piece of music is not defined by a single note, but by the journey it takes. The conductor replied, "Your lament has ended. Your adagio has been played. Now begins the scherzo, a time of rebuilding and change. It will be difficult, but it is the only path to a worthy finale." Lyra stood, her body still trembling, but her resolve hardening. The path was daunting, but it was a path. Her people had been given a second chance, a new piece of music to learn. She accepted the terms. As she returned to her shuttle, the conductor gave her one final, parting message. "There is one more condition, the one you call Krell. His mind has been touched by the overture. He has heard the chaos, and it has prepared him to understand the harmony. He will be your first student and your first teacher." The journey back to Xylos Prime was a stark contrast to Krell's frantic, terrified flight. Regent Lyra's shuttle moved through the void with a quiet purpose, a single, hopeful note in the vast silence. She had faced the composer of her people's requiem and had been handed not a death sentence, but a new, impossibly complex piece of music to perform. The terms of the atonement were broadcast across the remnants of the Imperium. There was confusion, resistance. Some military holdouts, clinging to the phantom limb of their former power, decried it as a capitulation to a ghost enemy. But the vast majority of the Xylan populace, still emotionally raw from the lament, felt the profound truth in the conductor's judgment. They had felt a glimmer of the galaxy's pain, and the demand for atonement resonated with that newfound empathy. Krell, as the conductor had decreed, became the reluctant linchpin of the entire endeavor. He was no longer a prisoner, but he was not free. He was an instrument, retuned by his terrifying experience, now tasked with teaching his people a language he barely understood himself. Lyra established a new center of learning, the Conservatory of Harmony, on a quiet, verdant moon. It was here, under Krell's haunted guidance, that the first generation of Xylan listeners was trained. He could not explain the score in terms of science or engineering. He taught them through metaphor, through meditation, through exercises that forced them to feel the subtle vibrations of a growing plant, the faint, sorrowful resonance of a fossilized bone, the complex, chaotic harmony of a bustling city. He taught them to hear the music of life. It was a slow, arduous process. Many failed, unable to quiet their own internal noise enough to hear the universe's subtle melody, but some succeeded. They were the ones who could feel a lie as a discordant pang in their own minds, who could sense the collective mood of a crowd as a tangible chord, who could look at the stars and feel not emptiness, but an infinite, silent symphony. The great dismantling began. The warships of the once mighty Imperium were brought to the orbital shipyards, not with the fanfare of victory, but with the quiet solemnity of a funeral. The indomitable Fury, recovered from its rogue jump by human guides, was the first to be unmade. Its plasma cannons were melted down and reformed into the life-giving hearts of the terraforming Orcs. Its armored hull, which had withstood the fury of suns, was transformed into the delicate, nurturing biodomes that would shelter fledgling species. Each of the 72 Orcs was a masterpiece of repurposed technology, a sword beaten into a plowshare on a planetary scale. They were christened not with names of conquest and power, but with concepts of the new harmony, the Ark of Empathy, the Ark of Restoration, the Ark of Quiet Songs. Volunteers flocked to join the crews of the Orcs. They were the children of the Lament, a generation that had been born into a world of inexplicable grief and had emerged into one of purpose. They were driven by a collective desire to heal the wounds their ancestors had inflicted, to resolve the dissonance that had echoed for a millennium. Under the guidance of the new listeners, they set out on their centuries-long voyages, heralds not of an empire, but of an apology. They found the scattered remnants of the Genosi living on barren asteroid colonies and helped them reclaim their lost oceanic world. They sought out the last of the crystalline elites and, using their newfound understanding of resonance, helped them rebuild their shattered thought songs. They did not impose. They offered. They did not command. They harmonized. Back on Xylos Prime, the transformation continued. The grand, militaristic architecture of the past was replaced with structures that were open, flowing, and acoustically perfect. The society that had been built on rigid order and unquestioning obedience began to value improvisation, collaboration, and emotional honesty. The weeping statues were preserved not as monuments of shame, but as reminders of the sorrow that had awakened them. They were a constant, silent lesson in the cost of dissonance. Lyra and Krell, the unlikely architects of this new age, mates, grew old watching their people change. Lyra, the pragmatic politician, learned from Krell to trust the feelings, the harmonies of her people over poles and projections. Krell, the haunted prophet, learned from Lyra to ground his cosmic visions in the practical needs of his society. They were the keynote and the counter-melody of their people's transformation. Centuries passed. The Xylos Imperium was a memory, a cautionary tale told to hatchlings. In its place was the Xylos Concordance, a civilization renowned throughout the galaxy not for its power, but for its empathy and wisdom. Their listeners were sought out as the finest mediators and diplomats, capable of resolving conflicts by finding the shared harmony between seemingly discordant peoples. The Orcs continued their work, their mission becoming a sacred, perpetual pilgrimage of healing on the bridge of the cadenza, which had not moved from its vigil over the Skrillian abyss in all that time. Elias Vance observed the final notes of his composition. The Xylan lament had ended long ago. The adagio of negotiation and the scherzo of rebuilding had been played. Now, he listened to the finale. It was a complex, beautiful fugue, a melody of atonement woven through the actions of a transformed species, their acts of kindness, their healing of old wounds, their quiet protection of nascent life. It all flowed back to him as a harmonious resolution to the violent chord his predecessor had been forced to strike. The human quarantine was still in effect. Humanity remained a ghost, a myth, the unseen composer of the galaxy's most terrible and beautiful symphonies. Their work was not to rule, but to listen, and, when necessary, to conduct, to prune the discordant and nurture the harmonious. Elias Vance closed his eyes, feeling the resolution of the Xylan symphony settle into a peaceful, stable chord within the grand cosmic score. The dissonance had been resolved. The performance was over. His gaze, not with his eyes but with his senses, turned to another sector of the galaxy, where a new, low, Aggressive drone was beginning to rise, a race of cybernetic conquerors. The Groll Boy were beginning to test the borders of their system, their broadcasts a monotonous, percussive rhythm of impending violence. A new dissonance was building. The conductor listened, his expression serene. The universe was an endless composition. There would always be another movement, another performance. He raised his hand, ready to conduct once more.